Oh, my allergies have been so bad lately. I cannot believe I left my Claritin at home. Hey, wait a minute. How does Claritin even work?
The concept of allergies is a relatively modern idea. Until the mid-20th century, it was widely believed that hay fever was caused by bacteria, but had peculiar similarities with illnesses people got from interacting with animals. In 1910, prior to knowing the biological role, Sir Henry Dale discovered that injecting histamine increased heart rate, breathing rate, and mucus secretion in rabbits and guinea pigs, and a high enough dosage led to death from asphyxiation. It was originally thought to be a bacterial product with no physiological purpose. Over the next 20 years, scientists isolated histamine in conditions without bacteria and tied it first to vasodilation, then immune responses and allergies. Over time, we learned more and more about the role of histamine, and in an effort to understand its biological mechanisms and functions, scientists discovered compounds known as antihistamines, which protect against histamine's effects. In the early 1930s, the first of these compounds, called piperoxine or benadine, was discovered. Benadine protected against bronchospasm, which is when the lung airways constrict to prevent airflow. Daniel Bovet received a Nobel Prize for his discovery, but benadine was too toxic for regular use in humans. He showed that guinea pigs injected with benadine, then histamine, had less severe symptoms than guinea pigs only injected with histamine. Histamine acts on 4 classes of receptors, H1, H2, H3, and H4, to produce physiological responses that we know as allergies. Each receptor class belongs to a subset of cells that respond to certain symptoms, and antihistamine act by binding to the H receptors to prevent histamines from binding to them. The most commonly targeted receptors are the H1 and the H2 receptors. Targeting the H1 receptor relieves inflammation and nose allergies, and targeting the H2 receptor relieves gastric hypersecretion. The chemistry of antihistamines just has to do with stabilizing the conformation of the receptors. So for this H1 receptor, H1 goes between the inactive and the active form. And while histamine stabilizes the active form, antihistamines stabilize the inactive form. So antihistamines occupy a different site and therefore are inverse agonists and not competitive antagonists. So they block the bodily response to histamine by binding to the receptor. H2, H3, and H4 receptors work slightly differently. All of them are found in heart, central nervous system, immune cells, and airway smooth muscles, but H1 is uniquely found in endothelial and epithelial cells. H2 is uniquely found in stomach lining cells, H3 in the central or peripheral nervous system, and H4 in the bone marrow. Each one of the activations leads to a slightly different symptom. H2 activation leads to CAMP-dependent activation. H3 activation releases neurotransmitters that lead to vasodilation. And H4 activation promotes cell migration towards the histamine and regulates immune cell functions.
Let's talk about the synthesis of some antihistamines, starting with piperoxine, or benadine. The synthesis of piperoxine begins with the condensation of catechol with epichlorohydrin in the presence of an aqueous base, such as sodium hydroxide. The oxyrane ring is opened by the phenoxide anion, which results in the formation of 2-hydroxymethyl-1,4-benzodioxane. The compound is then halogenated with thionyl chloride to yield 2-chloromethyl-1,4-benzodioxane. The chlorine is then displaced by piperidine to produce piperoxine. Now, let's talk about the synthesis of diphenhydramine, which is sold under the brand name Benadryl. This is a simple 2-step process. First, diphenylmethane is brominated in the presence of light to produce benzhydryl bromide. Benzhydryl bromide is then reacted with diphenylethylamine to produce diphenhydramine.
All right, so now that we know about the mechanism of antihistamines and how they work in the body, we can delve a little bit more into the structure. So as you can see here, the structure of antihistamines is generally the same across all the various types. You have an NH group here on the right with 2 R groups coming off. You have a CH2 spacer here in the center made up of usually 2 to 3 carbons. And then an X group here, which is the part that varies and the part that determines the structure and function of the antihistamine, with 2 aromatic rings coming off the side. The chirality at this X position is what dictates the potency of the antihistamine, so really how powerful it is in the body. and it also determines the interactions of the molecules. So, for example, you could have van der Waals forces. Now, the various classes of antihistamines can be seen here on the right. You can see that the N groups here are all pretty much the same. You have the CH2 groups here in the center, again, very much the same, but it is this left side here that varies between the different classes, and that is what determines the function. Now, overall, there are two different types of antihistamines. They are classified as either first generation or second generation. Now, first generation antihistamines are a little bit more common. They are the ones that pass through the blood-brain barrier. So drugs such as Benadryl fall under this class, and by passing through the blood-brain barrier, these molecules are able to enter the central nervous system, and by doing so, they generally cause drowsiness. So the second generation antihistamines do not pass the blood-brain barrier, and therefore are generally do not cause any drowsiness. All right, so let's say you are experiencing allergy symptoms and you want to know which drug you should take to relieve them. Well, on the right here, you can see the structure of two very common antihistamine drugs within the US. On the top here, we have loratadine, also known as Claritin, and then on the bottom, diphenhydramine, also known as Benadryl. So these common name brand drugs are all different types of antihistamines. As I said before, diphenhydramine is a first generation antihistamine, while loratadine is a second generation antihistamine. So Benadryl is going to cause that drowsiness, that sleepiness, that Claritin will not. So if you are looking to take this while going to bed, then Benadryl might be a great choice. However, if you want to perform your normal daily tasks, then Claritin might be better. However, loratadine is generally a little bit more expensive than diphenhydramine. And additionally, Benadryl is generally better for cold symptoms compared to Claritin. And this is because, again, Benadryl is able to pass through that blood-brain barrier, and by doing so, it's able to have some manipulation on the neuropharmacological effects of the histaminic and muscarinic receptors in the medulla, and that's the part of the brain that generally controls the symptoms that you are going to feel. So when you're congested or feeling sick, that's caused by that. It's the natural body response, and so by doing so, Benadryl is generally better at preventing those symptoms for colds. However, for allergies, both are effective in preventing allergy symptoms. Now, antihistamines do have some side effects, as you can see down here on the bottom. These are common name brand antihistamines within the US. Now, first generation antihistamines are going to cause that sleepiness, that drowsiness, and even occasionally blurred vision. Now, this is most of the time intended, but occasionally, if you are not expecting it, then it becomes a side effect. However, all antihistamines do have a tendency sometimes to cause headaches, feeling sick, dry mouth, or even difficulty peeing. However, side effects aren't super common, and generally these common antihistamines are pretty functional in what they're supposed to do. The last part I want to mention here is the business side of antihistamines. Now, this is important to mention because allergies and allergy symptoms are becoming much more common within the US and around the world. They chronically affect more than 50 million Americans every year, and it has actually become the sixth leading cause of chronic illness within the US. As you can see by the graphic here on the right, for Americans who are feeling allergy symptoms, they choose antihistamine pills, such as Benadryl, Zyrtec, or Allegra, over 50% of the time. And that doesn't even include down here, you can see there's a combination of drugs, so Claritin D, Allegra D, Zyrtec D, and that's an additional 26% of the time. So antihistamines are a big market within the US. They actually profited more than $3.4 billion last year. And this is because, again, drugs are generally a little bit more expensive, or sometimes a lot more expensive within the US compared to other countries around the world. So for example, Claritin can cost $80 to $85 per month here, where it may only cost $10 to $15 for a similar drug in another country. All right, so the last thing I want to mention is the additional money that's being poured into research, into potential additional treatments that antihistamines may have. So as you can see here, insomnia, anxiety, and even cancer are all potential diseases or diagnoses that antihistamines could potentially treat. For insomnia, this one makes a little bit more sense. Again, Benadryl is going to cause that drowsiness, that sleepiness. So insomnia can be solved with Benadryl or another first generation antihistamine, but generally those are not always recommended. Now, for anxiety, there actually is already an FDA approved drug. This is hydroxyzine. So, this is an antihistamine that is approved to treat anxiety. Now, for cancer, there's actually research going on right now at the University of Texas to discover how there might be an effect with antihistamines and the metastasis of cancer and preventing the blood vessels from growing into that cancer, so essentially killing the tumor. Now, this research is still pretty early on. I think it was completed in 2021, so there's still a long way to go, but it is kind of crazy to think that these anti-allergy drugs that we are all taking could potentially become a treatment for cancer.